Okay, welcome back. Well, we took a break and now we are finally back.
Okay, so the first topic is on quite a few people's minds. Maybe they're still kind of struggling to understand what the infinite regress is and why it's so bad, at least according to Strawson.
Are you guys familiar with infinite regress type arguments? Have you guys ever encountered in other kinds of arguments?
Yes, I have. I kind of recall it from a story where Achilles talking to a turtle and then the turtle asking what's the reason behind all his conditional claims. So Achilles makes one conditional claim and then the turtle is like, what makes this conditional true? And then Achilles said another conditional and then the turtle was like, and what makes this conditional true? And then like they went down the infinite regress of conditional and then the turtle was like, oh yeah, so logic doesn't exist.
I remember that very well actually. It's actually one of my favorite articles. It's written by the person who wrote Alice in the Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, right? Or otherwise known as Charles Dobson, that's his actual name. So he wrote two very famous logic papers and one of them is this one. So the idea is this. I will tell it in terms of modus ponens because I think it's a bit easier for our students to understand. So suppose you assert modus ponens. P, if P then Q, therefore Q, right? The other party challenges you. Well, how could you have concluded Q on the basis of P, if P then Q? Don't you need a way to connect the premises with the conclusion, right? And then if you surrender to that step, then you are immediately in trouble. Why? Because if you surrender to that step, then you admit that, okay, I guess I need another premise. If P and if P then Q, then Q. And then of course, once you allow that, you're going to end up being challenged to come up with yet more and more connecting premises. In order for an infinite regress to be a problem, it has to fulfill certain conditions. Just because there's an infinite series, it doesn't mean that there's a problem. Do you understand what I'm saying here? Right? Because there are many infinite series in the universe. Most of them don't cause any problems for us. Do you all not be able to sleep just because there's an infinite number of even numbers? Any of you couldn't sleep because of that? However, if I tell you something like, for every even number, there's another one. If you somehow manage to count to the next even number, I'm going to tell you that there's another one for you to count. It's not really a problem or so, right? So when does it become a problem?
Now, suppose we ask the question, right? So how can we know a language? Now, suppose we come to learn a language, right? By already knowing a certain language. So we need to know a language to know another language. Now, suppose if you take a Japanese class in NUS, and what's the medium of instruction, right? It will be in English, right? That's how you learn a new language. But if I need to know a language to acquire knowledge about a new language, if we follow that kind of logic, right, then I need to know another language before I can know the language that I already know to learn another language. Now, if insofar as we are trying to explain how we come to know a language, right, now the explanation is being deferred in a sense. So we are not actually doing the explanatory work. We are kind of postponing the explanation. Yeah, so that's one worry.
But notice that there is a very specific reason why it becomes a worry. You can think of it as a series of necessary conditions, right? So if it turns out that in order for me to explain how is it that I can learn a language now, I need to first assume that I already know a language. So if you hold this idea fixed, then it's as if I couldn't have learned this language because otherwise I would need to have learned that one, I would need to learn that one, and so on and so forth. The fact that there's an infinite number of those in itself is not necessarily the problem. The problem comes when we have to assume that you knew all of them, right? So likewise, in the case of numbers, the fact that there's an infinite number of numbers, integers, let's say, or even numbers, itself is not an issue. The problem comes if we expect you to count all of them. To use the example of learning a language that Yongtae talked about, if in order for me to explain how is it that I can learn a language now, I need to first assume that I have learned another language before this, and then another one before that, and so on and so forth. The natural thought is, it's not just the fact that it goes on forever, but the fact that you mean I have to know an infinite number of languages, actually know them, just in order for me to learn this one, cannot be, right? Because it's impossible for me to actually know an infinite number of languages. So that's that precise sense in which it's deferred, because we are counting upon the previous condition to be fulfilled in order for the later one to be accepted. Now, can you all see why Strawson needs both premise 1 and premise 2 of the basic argument in order for that to be a problematic regress? One student wrote in to ask, why isn't the second premise good enough to generate a regress? The second premise is, in principle, is enough for you to generate an infinite series of conditions going back. But this in itself is not a problem unless we are counting upon you to fulfill them in a particular way, like you have made actual choices, for instance. Does that make sense? Because otherwise, we are in trouble all the time, because I'm sure there are many infinite series that we have to encounter, and just think of all the numbers that you have to play with. And suppose the universe is infinite in size, apparently it's not, but suppose it is, it's not a problem for us, not unless you have to fly to the end of it. Then you are in trouble, right? Here's another famous one, Xero's paradox. If it turns out that in order for me to go from A to B, I must first pass the midway point, the actual event. And in order for me to pass the midway point, I must first pass the quarter way point, which is the other midway point, and so on and so forth. So if it turns out that it's a series of necessary conditions such that in order for me to go from A to B, I must have passed through those infinite number of points, then I'm in trouble, because it's the fact that I have to actually do all those infinite number of things that is the trouble. It's not the fact that there's an infinite number of things. Like for instance, if someone tells you that in principle the future can go on indefinitely, that's not a problem. If someone tells you that the past can go on indefinitely, is that a problem? This is actually controversial. It can actually, go either way, and there are good philosophers on both sides who are arguing. Do you know about this one? Can the past go on forever? Is the past finite or infinite?
Yeah, so one worry is if it's infinite, then we can't explain how we arrive at this point, right?
Yeah, if you are going with a certain style of cosmological argument, the Kalam one specifically, in fact, then they're going to make use of the fact that, the thing that connects the past to us is, a causal chain, a certain kind of causal chain, a temporal causal chain, in fact. And it turns out that you don't get to have the effect unless you already have the cause. That structure makes it such that cause is the necessary condition of effect. Since the effect really does occur, it would seem as if surely there must have been. So when you put it in that way, so the Kalam style argument would say that no, that chain cannot go on forever. I was telling a student this, right? So you're driving, and then the car in front of you suddenly stops, so you bang into him because you couldn't quite jam brake fast enough. Then you came out to scold the guy and said, why you stop? And then the guy says, the guy in front of me jam brake and stop, right? So the two of you walk forward to find the next guy and ask him, like, why do you stop? So the question is, can this go on forever? Given that the guy in front of you did jam brakes and stop, which led to you really stopping, right? So the effect, so to speak, really did happen. So can there be an infinite regress of temporal causes if the effect really happens? Well, the philosophers behind the Kalam style argument are going to say, no, you can't do that. That's impossible for there to be infinite regress of temporal causes. There must have been a first event. There is definitely one, you can say, respectable line of thinking. Is it the only possible line of thinking? No. Some people really do disagree with this. So this is actually quite curious. But we are not doing cosmological argument in our class anymore. And even the cosmological argument that we did in our class is not a temporal version. It's not a Kalam version anyway. So are we good with this one? There is actually a paper I know of, what's so bad about infinite regress? He asked that question and he wants to argue that in many cases it's not as bad as people think. I should go find the paper, and anyone who is interested can go read it for yourself. I remember that when I first mentioned this to a class some years ago, one of my students, one of your seniors, years later he told me that afternoon he went walking around in one of the malls because he was so shell-shocked by the idea that not all infinite regress are problematic. He was actually of the opinion that surely if it's infinite regress there must be a problem. And actually that's not true. Not all infinite regress must be a problem. But in the case of Strawson, do you think it's a problem? It is a problem if it turns out that this is a series of necessary conditions and you can't be morally responsible in the last step, right? Unless you really do fulfill the earlier conditions. And if it turns out that there is an infinite number of them, and very specifically you fulfill them by having made actual choices, now you are really in trouble. It's like saying that, you reached the endpoint. In order for you to reach the endpoint, you must have counted to infinity. And then you're really in trouble. Right? Because those are impossible things. And the sense in which it's impossible is not that you don't have enough time. It's not that you can't do it fast enough. It's because it's a kind of a conceptual incoherence to think that we can complete an infinite task. That is the sense of it. And the usual example I always ask students to think about is, if someone tells you that he has completed counting to infinity, then you gotta ask the guy, wow, how do you manage to do it? That last number, is it even number or odd number? Whichever way you go, there's a problem, right? It's not the kind of stuff that can be done. Some people try to pull a fast one and say, no, we can build a machine. Let's try to imagine that we can build a machine such that you can count always twice as fast as the last count. Then theoretically, it's a conversion series, alright? So the first count, it takes 1 minute, the next one, half a minute, next one, quarter minute. Those of you who know your math can figure out the convergence. In a sense, the series limits within a certain finite time. Good for you. But that last one, is it odd and even? You go and answer that first. It's a conceptual impossibility. Or another way, I sometimes will tell some students, if next time you are in charge of a lot of money giving out your scientific grants and people come to you and say that we would like to take out $1 million to create a machine that can count to infinity, don't ever give them the money. Please don't. Even if they tell you things like, oh no, this is a multi-generation project, it'll take us 1,000 years, don't worry, our descendants, they will count, they will no, do not give them the money. Any further thoughts about this?
Prof, so I have one question. For when we use the term infinite regress, right? When we use the word regress, do we mean something like a negative connotation behind it?
No, the regress that refers to going backwards. It's not regress in a negative sense, but in the sense of we got this one here that you need something else behind it, you need something else behind it or before it or whatever, it keeps going. That's where the word regress is coming from. I want to go back to the puzzle that Yongtek raised. Suppose someone says that in order for you to learn a language, you must know another one first. Now you got a regress problem, right? It's not just that you can set up an infinite series, but more importantly, in order for you to fulfill every item in the series, you need to actually know a language. But surely we couldn't possibly know an infinite number of languages or learn an infinite number of languages. Again, I want to emphasize, it's not about time, it's not about how big your brain is. It's about, the last language, is it an even number language or odd number language? You go and answer that first. It's that kind of problem. So what's the solution to the language one?
Just say that you don't need to know a language in order to acquire another one.
Yeah, you have to deny that. You have to deny that one. In that particular case, the easy way to escape the regress is to stop it at the point of that particular premise. We call that a regressive premise. Just like premise 2 of Strawson's basic argument is a regressive premise. Premise of this nature generates regresses. And in this case, it's a lot easier to stop the regress by saying that it's just not true that in order for you to learn a language, you have to know another one. Surely the first one, that's not how it works, right? Surely there must be at least one language that you didn't learn because you had access to another language. What about Strawson? Why then do you think that we would prefer to break it by looking more carefully at premise 1 rather than premise 2? So that's one question that I think some students will have. Why not just reject premise 2 altogether? If you actually go and read Susan Hurley, she does want to reject premise 2. I'll just say that first. So it's not true that this is the end of the story. This is only one part of the story. And this is going to bring us to a different topic altogether, which we should come to later.
Mm.
Yeah.